At the dawn of the new millennium, the United States stood at the height of its global power. With the Soviet Union gone, Washington was the undisputed superpower, shaping the world according to its vision. Then came the attacks of September 11th, 2001, an event that shook America to its core and redefined its foreign policy. From that moment, the White House believed it had both the justification and the urgency to redraw the map of the Middle East. Almost immediately, Iraq returned to the center of political conversations in Washington. Publicly, the U.S. administration spoke of Saddam Hussein's alleged weapons of mass destruction. Officials claimed that Baghdad was hiding dangerous arsenals, and that Saddam himself posed a threat not only to his neighbors, but to the entire world. Behind closed doors, however, other motives were discussed: strategic influence, oil, and reshaping the region to secure American dominance. High-level meetings became routine. Senior officials from the Pentagon, the State Department, and intelligence agencies gathered around long tables filled with maps of Iraq. For the hawks in the administration, the path was clear. Iraq must be invaded, its regime dismantled, and a new order imposed. Voices of caution did exist, warning of chaos and unintended consequences, but they were quickly overshadowed by those determined to act. In Congress, debates dragged on, but the momentum was moving in one direction. The American media amplified the message. Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, Iraq supported terror, and Iraq must be stopped. Day by day, the American public was prepared for war, even though the evidence was weak and in some cases entirely fabricated. The diplomatic stage was no less dramatic. At the United Nations, the United States pushed for a resolution that would authorize the use of force. France, Russia, and Germany resisted, urging patience and more time for weapons inspectors. Yet Washington and London had already made up their minds. For them, the decision was final. War was not a question of if, but when. By early 2003, the signs were undeniable. In Kuwait, thousands of American and British troops filled massive desert camps. Tanks, helicopters, and artillery stretched across the sand in an overwhelming display of force. Warships waited in the Gulf, their missile silos loaded. From the outside, it was clear. The storm was coming. Inside Iraq, the situation was grim. A decade of sanctions had crippled the economy and weakened the military. The once formidable Iraqi army was poorly equipped, its weapons outdated, its morale low. Yet Saddam Hussein remained defiant. On television, he projected confidence, promising that Iraq would resist. But within his inner circle, there was a growing recognition that the coming war would be unlike anything Iraq had faced before. In Washington, the plan had already been named: shock and awe. The idea was simple but brutal. Unleash overwhelming force in the very first hours of the war. Bomb Baghdad into submission, paralyze the leadership, and terrify the population into surrender. On the eve of invasion, President George W. Bush addressed the world. His message was blunt: Saddam Hussein must leave Iraq or face war. Everyone knew this was no genuine offer. It was the final warning before the attack began. And so by March 2003, the stage was set. American tanks stood ready on the border, missiles pointed at Iraqi skies, and soldiers braced for the order to advance. Inside Baghdad, families huddled in their homes, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. The question was no longer whether war would come. The question was how quickly it would consume the heart of Iraq. The road to war was paved with fear, ambition, and calculations of power. Decisions made in Washington would soon change the course of a nation and alter the Middle East for decades to come. On the night of March 20th, 2003, the world watched as Baghdad lit up under a storm of fire. It was the moment the United States had promised, the beginning of the war, the launch of Operation Shock and Awe. The strategy was designed to overwhelm. Hundreds of cruise missiles were launched from American warships in the Gulf. At the same time, waves of bombers and fighter jets descended from the skies, striking targets across the Iraqi capital. The goal was not only to destroy military infrastructure, but also to crush the will of an entire nation before the ground war even began. For viewers across the globe, the images were unforgettable. Explosions lit the skyline, sending fireballs high into the night sky. Towering columns of smoke rose above government buildings, while the horizon glowed red as though the city itself was on fire. News networks broadcast live, describing the spectacle as though it were both a military operation and a theatrical event. Inside Baghdad, the reality was far more terrifying. Families huddled together in basements or in the darkest corners of their homes. The ground shook with each detonation, windows shattered, and the constant roar of jets filled the air. For ordinary Iraqis, there was no distinction between military and civilian targets. Every sound in the sky could mean death. The Iraqi government tried to project calm. Saddam Hussein appeared on state television, declaring that Iraq would endure and that the Americans would fail. Anti-aircraft guns fired tracer rounds into the night, their red streaks climbing helplessly toward the bombers. But the truth was evident. Iraq's defenses were no match for the precision and scale of the assault. American commanders, watching from secure command centers, considered the opening strikes a success. Radar stations, communication hubs, and command posts were being destroyed one after another. Bridges and highways that connected Iraqi units were severed. Within hours, Iraq's ability to coordinate a national defense had been shattered. For the U.S. military, this was the essence of shock and awe. To make resistance seem hopeless, to deliver such overwhelming firepower that the psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. But even as the bombs fell, preparations were already underway on the ground. To the south, tens of thousands of American and British troops waited along the border, engines running, weapons loaded. For them, the air campaign was only the beginning. Soon, they would cross into Iraq, advancing on highways and desert roads toward the heart of the country. As the night gave way to dawn, Baghdad smoldered under a blanket of smoke. The city had survived the first wave, but the tone had been set. The United States had unleashed its power with a fury not seen in the region for decades. The message was unmistakable. The invasion had begun, and Iraq was about to face a war unlike any in its modern history. At dawn on March 21, 2003, after a night of relentless airstrikes, the second phase of the war began. Along the flat desert border between Kuwait and Iraq, long columns of American and British forces came to life. Engines roared, dust clouds rose into the air, and convoys of tanks and armored vehicles pushed north, crossing into Iraqi territory. The ground invasion was designed for speed. U.S. commanders wanted to move so quickly that the Iraqi army would never have the chance to regroup. Soldiers had trained for months, their vehicles loaded with supplies, their maps marked with key highways leading toward Baghdad. In the first hours, resistance was minimal. Border outposts were bombed before the troops even arrived, and many Iraqi defenders abandoned their positions. Some surrendered immediately, raising their hands as the convoys approached. Others melted away into the countryside. The shock from the initial airstrikes had done its work. Many Iraqi units simply chose not to fight. Still, the advance was not without challenges. In towns like Qasr and Nasiriyah, Iraqi forces put up stronger resistance. Small groups of soldiers, along with Saddam's Fedayeen militia, tried to ambush the convoys. They fired rifles, set up machine guns in alleyways, and even launched rocket-propelled grenades at armored vehicles. The Americans responded with overwhelming firepower. Tanks blasted through defenses, helicopters swept the skies, and artillery rained down on suspected positions. The battles were short but brutal, leaving behind burning vehicles, abandoned trenches, and scattered equipment. Meanwhile, in Basra, the British Army faced a more complicated fight. The city, Iraq's second largest, was heavily fortified and defended by elements of the Republican Guard. Rather than storming Basra directly, the British laid siege to it, surrounding the city and striking key targets with artillery and airstrikes. For the civilians trapped inside, it was the beginning of a long and difficult ordeal. Despite these scattered pockets of resistance, the overall momentum was clear. The coalition's advance resembled a tidal wave moving northward. Columns of armored vehicles stretched for miles, leaving trails in the sand. Supply trucks followed close behind, carrying fuel, ammunition, and food. Overhead, American aircraft maintained constant patrols, ensuring that no Iraqi counterattack could disrupt the push. For many Iraqi soldiers, the disparity in technology was overwhelming. Their aging tanks and rifles were no match for precision-guided missiles and satellite-guided artillery. Even when they fought bravely, the outcome was almost always predetermined. By the end of the first week, coalition forces had already advanced hundreds of kilometers into Iraq. Baghdad, once thought to be months away, now seemed only weeks or even days distant. The plan of a rapid, decisive invasion was working, at least for the moment. But the march north also revealed a deeper truth. While the Iraqi army could be bypassed and defeated in open battles, the story inside the cities would be different. In places like Nasiriyah and Basra, the fighting showed glimpses of what lay ahead: urban resistance, chaos, and a war that would not end with the fall of the capital. For the coalition commanders, however, the focus remained fixed. Baghdad was the ultimate prize, and every mile crossed brought them closer. The border had been breached, the highways secured, and the path to the heart of Iraq now lay wide open. As coalition forces pushed deeper into Iraq, the southern cities became the first true test of resistance. Unlike the quiet border outposts that collapsed almost instantly, towns such as Basra and Nasiriyah refused to fall so easily. Here, the war took on a different face: urban battles, street fighting, and the first signs that not all Iraqis would simply step aside. Basra, Iraq's second-largest city and its gateway to the Persian Gulf, held enormous strategic value. Its port was vital for trade, its oil fields were critical for revenue, and its dense neighborhoods made it a potential stronghold for defenders. The British Army, tasked with capturing the city, quickly realized that a direct assault would be costly. Instead, they surrounded Basra, cutting it off from the outside world. Artillery shells rained down on suspected military positions, while aircraft circled overhead. Inside the city, Iraqi troops, including elements of the Republican Guard, fought sporadically, launching small attacks and retreating into the crowded streets. The siege of Basra dragged on for days. Civilians suffered most. Electricity failed, water supplies dwindled, and smoke from burning buildings choked the air. From the outside, it seemed only a matter of time before the city collapsed. Yet its defenders held out longer than expected. For the British forces, Basra became a slow and grinding operation, one that revealed the difficulty of fighting in an urban environment. Further north, in the city of Nasiriyah, the Americans faced a far more direct confrontation. Located along the Euphrates River, Nasiriyah was a key crossing point on the road to Baghdad. When U.S. Marines entered the city, they encountered fierce resistance from Iraqi soldiers and Fedayeen fighters. What began as a routine advance quickly turned into chaotic street battles. Gunfire echoed through the narrow alleys. RPGs struck armored vehicles. Ambushes were launched from rooftops and hidden courtyards. For the Marines, it was a sobering reminder that even with superior technology, urban warfare could be deadly. Convoys became trapped in confusing city streets, and firefights stretched late into the night. The battle for Nasiriyah became one of the bloodiest confrontations of the early invasion. While U.S. forces eventually secured control, the cost was high, and the fighting left deep scars on the city. Burned-out vehicles and shattered homes lined the streets, reminders of the ferocity of the clashes. Meanwhile, at Qasr, the small southern port town, coalition forces fought another symbolic battle. Though far less significant in size than Basra or Nasiriyah, Qasr was vital for logistics. Once secured, it allowed the coalition to bring in supplies by sea, strengthening their foothold in southern Iraq. Taken together, the battles of Basra, Nasiriyah, and Qasr highlighted the challenges ahead. They showed that Iraq's defense was not uniform. While some areas collapsed quickly, others resisted fiercely. They also demonstrated that controlling cities was far more complex than simply advancing across open desert. For civilians, the suffering was immense. Bombardments struck neighborhoods, families fled their homes, and services collapsed. In the streets of Basra and Nasiriyah, the line between military target and civilian life blurred. To many Iraqis, the war already felt less like liberation and more like destruction. By the end of March, however, the coalition had achieved its goals in the south. The resistance had been crushed, the ports secured, and the road north reopened. Yet the battles in Basra and Nasiriyah left an important lesson. Baghdad might not fall without a fight, and the cost of taking it could be far higher than the swift advance suggested. As coalition forces continued their push northward, the war began to change shape. In the early days, Iraqi defenses had crumbled quickly. Towns had been bypassed, soldiers had surrendered, and the road to Baghdad seemed wide open. But in places like Fallujah and Najaf, the narrative shifted. Here, for the first time, coalition troops encountered determined resistance. Fallujah, a city west of Baghdad along the Euphrates River, had long been known for its strong tribal character and conservative traditions. When U.S. convoys approached the city, they did not find abandoned checkpoints or empty streets. Instead, small groups of Iraqi fighters waited in hidden positions. They used guerrilla tactics, ambushes from alleyways, sniper fire from rooftops, and hit-and-run attacks. For the Americans, this was a jarring contrast to the easy victories of the South. Though heavily outgunned, the fighters in Fallujah displayed determination. In response, U.S. forces unleashed overwhelming firepower. Apache helicopters swept the skies, tanks fired into suspected strongholds, and artillery targeted entire neighborhoods thought to house resistance. Within days, Fallujah was marked by smoke, rubble, and fear. The city would later become a symbol of resistance, but even in these early weeks, it foreshadowed the difficulties of occupying Iraq. Further south, in the holy city of Najaf, the battle carried an even heavier weight. Najaf was not just another Iraqi town. It was one of the most sacred cities in Shia Islam, home to the shrine of Imam Ali. Fighting here was dangerous not only militarily but also politically. Any misstep risked inflaming sectarian tensions across the country and beyond. Despite its sacred status, Najaf became a battleground. Iraqi fighters, including members of Saddam's Fedayeen, attempted to use the city as a staging ground. They launched attacks on coalition units approaching from the south. Gunfire erupted in the outskirts, and skirmishes broke out in the narrow streets. U.S. troops advanced cautiously, aware of the city's significance, but unwilling to allow it to become a sanctuary for resistance. The clashes in Najaf, though limited compared to the massive battles elsewhere, carried symbolic weight. They revealed that the war was not just about defeating Iraq's conventional army. It was also about facing irregular fighters, militias, and volunteers who were motivated by ideology, religion, or simple defiance. For Iraqi civilians, these battles were devastating. In Fallujah, families endured bombardments that destroyed homes and markets. In Najaf, the fear of fighting near sacred shrines forced many to flee. For ordinary Iraqis, the difference between liberation and occupation was already blurred. From the perspective of coalition commanders, these uprisings were minor pockets of resistance. They believed Baghdad would still fall quickly, and that the war would be decided there. But the reality was more complex. The flames of Fallujah and the unrest in Najaf signaled that the real struggle might not end with the fall of the capital. Instead, it hinted at the long and bloody insurgency that would define Iraq in the years to come. By late March 2003, coalition commanders shifted their focus from the battles of the south to the long highways leading north. The goal was simple: reach Baghdad as quickly as possible while preventing Iraqi forces from regrouping. To achieve this, the coalition launched a two-pronged advance. One column pushing along the Euphrates, the other following the Tigris. Together, they formed a tightening grip on the capital. The advance was relentless. American armored divisions surged forward across desert roads, convoys stretching for miles. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, supply trucks and fuel convoys moved in near-constant motion, day and night. Helicopters circled above, and warplanes patrolled the skies, ensuring that no Iraqi counterattack could halt the march. Resistance along the highways was scattered. Some Iraqi soldiers attempted ambushes, firing RPGs or rifles at convoys. Fedayeen fighters staged hit-and-run attacks from villages and palm groves. But every move was answered with overwhelming force. Precision-guided bombs struck suspected ambush points, artillery blasted strongholds, and helicopters swept the roads with missiles. The imbalance in technology and firepower left the outcome never in doubt. Bridges became critical objectives. To advance north, the coalition needed control of the crossings over the Tigris and Euphrates. Many were destroyed by airstrikes to cut Iraqi supply lines, while others were seized intact by American forces. Each captured bridge tightened the noose around Baghdad. For U.S. commanders, the speed of the advance was a central part of the strategy. They called it rapid dominance. The aim was to bypass major cities, avoid prolonged urban fighting, and push forward before Iraqi forces could organize. Basra, Nasiriyah, and Najaf were left behind. while the spearhead divisions pressed on toward the capital. Yet the rapid advance was not without its challenges. Sandstorms swept across the desert, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Convoys were sometimes forced to halt, engines idling in thick orange haze. Supply lines also stretched thin. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to be moved hundreds of kilometers through hostile territory. Each mile gained required a vast logistical effort. Meanwhile, Iraqi civilians along the highways watched the war roll past their towns. Some waved cautiously, unsure whether to welcome or fear the convoys. Others fled their homes, terrified of becoming caught in crossfire. Smoke from burning vehicles and bombed positions often hung in the air, a constant reminder of the destruction left in the coalition's wake. By the end of the first week, American forces had advanced hundreds of kilometers inside Iraq. Maps in Washington showed rapid progress, each arrow pointing closer to Baghdad. News anchors spoke of the invasion as though the fall of the capital was inevitable. Yet beneath the confident headlines, one fact remained. The hardest battle still lay ahead. The drive along the Tigris and Euphrates was more than just a military maneuver. It was the dramatic prelude to the showdown in Baghdad. Every kilometer closed the distance to the capital, and every day brought coalition troops closer to the heart of Saddam Hussein's regime. The march north was swift, decisive, and seemingly unstoppable. But as the city's skyline loomed on the horizon, commanders knew that taking Baghdad would not be as simple as the open roads of the desert. The final act was about to begin. As coalition forces closed in on Baghdad in early April 2003, all eyes turned to a single strategic objective: Saddam International Airport, later renamed Baghdad International Airport. Control of this facility would mean control of the main gateway to the capital. It was more than just an airfield. It was a symbol of sovereignty, a military hub, and the last shield before the city itself. On the evening of April 3rd, American armored columns advanced toward the airport. The approach was tense. U.S. tanks and infantry moved along highways littered with abandoned Iraqi vehicles, while artillery fire echoed in the distance. Overhead, aircraft circled constantly, ready to strike at any sign of resistance. The Iraqi defenders were not absent. Elements of the Republican Guard and other loyal units had dug into positions around the airport, determined to make a stand. For them, this was more than a piece of infrastructure. It was the final barrier to protect Baghdad. They manned artillery batteries, machine gun nests, and anti-aircraft emplacements, waiting for the clash. When the attack began, the night sky lit up with tracer fire. Iraqi guns fired into the darkness, while U.S. tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles answered with overwhelming firepower. Apache helicopters rained down missiles on hardened positions. The thunder of explosions rolled across the desert as coalition forces pressed forward. Inside the airport grounds, fighting was fierce. Hangars, runways, and terminals turned into battlegrounds. Iraqi troops launched desperate counterattacks, some charging against tanks with little more than rifles or RPGs. The Americans, however, held the advantage. With precision strikes and relentless momentum, they pushed deeper into the complex. By dawn, U.S. forces had seized much of the airport. Smoke drifted over runways scarred by craters, while shattered Iraqi equipment burned across the grounds. For American commanders, the capture of the airport was a decisive victory. It not only secured a logistical base close to Baghdad, but also sent a powerful message. The capital was within reach. Yet the battle was not without cost. Coalition units reported intense resistance, and the fighting highlighted the desperation of Iraqi defenders. For many Iraqis, the fall of the airport symbolized the inevitable collapse of the regime. Rumors spread quickly through Baghdad. If the Americans controlled the airport, then the city itself could not hold out for long. In Washington, the news was greeted with triumph. Headlines proclaimed the victory, and analysts spoke of the final approach to Baghdad. For Iraqis watching from their homes, however, the mood was far darker. The sounds of explosions carried into the city, reminding civilians that the war was now at their doorstep. The battle for Baghdad International Airport marked the threshold moment of the invasion. With the airfield secured, nothing stood between coalition forces and the heart of the Iraqi capital. Within days, the world would witness the fall of Baghdad itself. On the morning of April 9, 2003, the war reached its climax. After weeks of rapid advances, bombings, and skirmishes, American tanks rolled into the heart of Baghdad. The capital of Iraq, once one of the most formidable cities in the Middle East, lay exposed. What had once seemed unthinkable was now unfolding before the eyes of the world. The fall of Baghdad. The entry into the city was surreal. Coalition forces expected heavy resistance, perhaps block-by-block fighting against the Republican Guard. Instead, they encountered only scattered gunfire and abandoned positions. The once proud Iraqi army had melted away. Checkpoints were deserted, uniforms discarded, and weapons left behind in haste. The regime that had ruled for decades was collapsing in real time. For the civilians of Baghdad, the moment was filled with fear, confusion, and disbelief. Some locked their doors and stayed inside, listening to the rumble of tanks outside. Others cautiously emerged into the streets, staring in silence as foreign soldiers drove through their neighborhoods. Was this liberation? Was it occupation? For most, it was simply the terrifying unknown. The defining image of that day came in Firdaus Square. A massive bronze statue of Saddam Hussein towered over the plaza, a symbol of his authority and dominance. As American tanks arrived, a crowd gathered. With ropes tied around the statue, attempts were made to pull it down. At first, the efforts failed. The statue stood firm. Then, in a moment broadcast live across the world, a U.S. tank extended a cable, and with a powerful pull, the statue toppled. The sight of Saddam's likeness crashing to the ground sent shockwaves around the globe. For some, it symbolized the end of dictatorship. For others, it was the humiliation of a nation under foreign boots. Men cheered, some jumped on the fallen monument, while others watched quietly, uncertain of what this moment would truly mean for Iraq. But beneath the symbolism lay a grim reality. With the regime gone, the structures of the state vanished almost overnight. Government ministries were abandoned, their doors flung open to looters. Museums were ransacked, priceless artifacts stolen or destroyed. Police stations and army barracks stood empty. The authority that had once held Iraq together had disintegrated in a matter of days. For the United States, the fall of Baghdad was presented as a decisive victory. Officials in Washington declared that freedom had come to Iraq, that a dictatorship had been overthrown, and that a new era had begun. The television images of cheering Iraqis and the toppled statue reinforced the message of triumph. But on the ground, the picture was far more complicated. Baghdad was a city in chaos. Fires burned across neighborhoods. Gunfire echoed sporadically. With no functioning government, no police, and no security, Ordinary Iraqis were left to fend for themselves in a vacuum of power. For many, the fear of Saddam's rule had been replaced by the fear of lawlessness. The collapse of Baghdad was not just the end of a regime, it was the end of a state. In just 3 weeks, the United States had dismantled the government, destroyed its army, and taken its capital. Yet what came next was unclear. The questions of who would govern Iraq, how order would be restored, and what role the coalition would play remained unanswered. April 9th became a date etched into history. The fall of Baghdad marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, far more uncertain one. The city had been taken, the statue had fallen, and the regime had collapsed. But for Iraq, the war was not over. In many ways, it was only beginning. When Baghdad fell on April 9, 2003, the world was told that the war was over. The regime had collapsed, the army had vanished, and American forces now occupied the Iraqi capital. But for the people living inside the city, the day after did not bring peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of chaos. The Iraqi state disintegrated almost overnight. Ministries and government offices stood abandoned, their doors broken open. Looters poured in, carrying away chairs, computers, and furniture. Priceless artifacts disappeared from museums. Historical treasures that had survived for thousands of years vanished in a matter of hours. Police stations were empty, their weapons stolen, their cells deserted. Even hospitals were stripped of supplies. Coalition soldiers were present, but they did little to stop the breakdown. Some guarded their bases, others focused on securing military objectives. American commanders had prepared for the invasion, but not for the collapse of law and order that followed. The result was a vacuum of authority, an entire country without functioning institutions. For civilians, life became unpredictable. Without electricity or clean water, daily survival grew difficult. Streets filled with smoke from fires set during looting. Gunfire echoed at night as armed groups began to emerge. Families locked their homes, unsure whether to fear criminals, militias, or the occupying forces themselves. Politically, Iraq had no leadership. Saddam Hussein was gone, his government scattered, and no replacement was ready. The United States assumed control, but had no clear plan for governing a fractured nation. The promise of liberation quickly gave way to uncertainty. Was Iraq free, or was it simply occupied? In Washington, officials celebrated. Speeches declared that Iraq had been liberated, that the war was won, and that a new democratic future lay ahead. The television image of Saddam's statue falling was replayed again and again as proof of victory. Yet behind the triumphant rhetoric, the reality on the ground told a different story. What emerged in those early days was not stability, but division. Long-suppressed ethnic and sectarian tensions began to surface. Shia, Sunni, and Kurdish communities all looked to the future with different expectations. Armed groups took advantage of the chaos, planting the seeds of insurgency. The violence that followed would claim far more lives than the initial invasion. For Iraqis, the day after the fall of Baghdad was not a celebration, but a moment of shock. A dictator was gone, but so was the state. Order had dissolved into disorder, and fear had taken on a new form. The uncertainty of what came next was heavier than the war itself. For the world, April 2003 seemed like the end of a short war. In truth, it was the beginning of a long struggle that would reshape Iraq, the Middle East, and global politics for decades to come. The power vacuum left behind became the defining legacy of the invasion. The day after was not peace. It was the dawn of a new conflict.